A man is dying in a room in Medina, and nobody in that room knows what happens to the world in the next hour. It is the year 632. The Prophet Muhammad has just breathed his last breath, and outside the walls of his house, a crowd of his closest companions is arguing, not about grief, not yet, but about something far more dangerous. Who leads now? There is no king waiting in line. There is no crown, no throne, no written rule book for what comes next. For the first time in the history of this new faith, there is a vacuum of power, and vacuums like this one have a way of deciding the fate of empires. What happens in the next few hours in a courtyard called Saqifa will set off a chain of events that stretches across 14 centuries, through deserts and rivers, through golden libraries and burning cities, through 57 kings who never wore a crown, but called themselves something far more powerful. Khalifa. Successor. Deputy. The one who stands in the place of a prophet who can never be replaced. This is the story of every Caliphate that ever ruled in the name of Islam. How they rose, how they ruled, and one by one, how they fell. And by the end of this, you will understand something most people never stop to think about. The entire modern Middle East, the borders on your map right now, the tensions you see on the news today. Almost all of it traces back to decisions made in the first 100 years after that argument in Saqifa. Let's go back there. Inside that courtyard, two of the most senior companions of the Prophet, Abu Bakr and Umar ibn al-Khattab, stand in the middle of a crowd that could have split the entire faith apart in its very first hours. Different groups want different leaders. Tempers are rising. And then, in a moment historians still study closely, Umar takes Abu Bakr's hand and pledges allegiance to him first, publicly, in front of everyone. The crowd follows. Just like that, a war that could have started before Islam even had a chance to breathe is avoided, and Abu Bakr becomes the very first Khalifa, the first Caliph of the Muslim world. He rules for barely over 2 years. But in those 2 years, he does something that most empires take a generation to do. He holds the newborn Islamic State together through what is called the Ridda Wars, a series of rebellions where tribes across Arabia try to break away the moment the Prophet is gone. Abu Bakr crushes the rebellions, unifies Arabia under one banner, and dies in 634, passing the torch to a man who will turn a regional faith into a continental power. That man is Umar ibn al-Khattab. And what Umar does next is almost hard to believe. Under his 10 years of rule, the armies of this caliphate defeat the Byzantine Empire in the north and shatter the mighty Sasanian Persian Empire, one of the 2 superpowers of the ancient world, in the east. Jerusalem falls, Damascus falls, Egypt falls. In a single decade, a state that started as a cluster of desert tribes becomes one of the largest empires on earth. And it does it with an administrative brilliance that still gets studied today. Umar builds treasuries, sets up a formal calendar, creates systems of governance for conquered peoples that, for the era, are remarkably structured. Then, in 644, while leading prayer in the mosque, Umar is stabbed by a Persian slave with a personal grievance. He dies days later. And here is where the story starts to turn. Because up until now, this has been a story of unity. From here, it slowly becomes a story of fracture. Uthman ibn Affan becomes the 3rd Khalifa. Under him, the empire keeps expanding, and one of his most lasting achievements is something you may not expect. He standardizes the Quran into a single official text, the version read across the entire Muslim world today, ending the risk of regional variations splitting the faith's core scripture. But politically, cracks are forming. Accusations of nepotism, favoritism toward his own clan, the Umayyads, start spreading through the provinces. Discontent boils. And in 656, a group of rebels lays siege to Uthman's house in Medina and kills him while he is reading the Quran. This is the moment everything changes. The 4th Khalifa, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's own cousin and son-in-law, inherits a caliphate that is now bleeding from the inside. Civil war breaks out. The Battle of the Camel, the Battle of Siffin, A political and spiritual rift emerges that will echo for the rest of history. The split between what will become known as Sunni and Shia Islam, rooted in this very disagreement over who had the right to lead after the Prophet. In 661, Ali is assassinated while praying in a mosque in Kufa, and with his death, the era known as the Rashidun Caliphate, the Rightly Guided Caliphate, comes to an end. 4 men, 29 years, and an empire that had already grown larger than Rome at its peak. But the story does not end. It transforms. A man named Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus, and a relative of the murdered Uthman, seizes power, and with him begins something entirely new. The Umayyad Caliphate, the first hereditary dynasty in Islamic history. Instead of a council choosing the next leader, Muawiyah does something the Rashidun era never did. He names his own son as his successor. The caliphate becomes a monarchy in everything but name. Under the Umayyads, ruling from Damascus, the empire explodes outward at a speed that is almost hard to comprehend. Their armies march west across all of North Africa, cross the Strait of Gibraltar, and conquer nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, by 711. In the east, they push through Central Asia and reach the Indus River Valley. At its absolute height, the Umayyad Caliphate stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of China, over 5 million square miles, making it, at the time, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, larger even than the Roman Empire at its peak. But an empire this vast, built this fast, carries the seeds of its own instability. The Umayyads increasingly favor Arab elites over non-Arab converts, creating resentment among Persian, Egyptian, and other Muslim populations who feel like second-class citizens in their own faith. That resentment is patient. It waits in the shadows for decades. And then, in the 740s, it erupts, led by a movement backed by descendants of the Prophet's uncle, Abbas. In 750, the Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads in a brutal, calculated campaign, and in one of the most infamous events in Islamic political history, they invite the surviving members of the Umayyad royal family to a peace banquet, and slaughter nearly all of them there. One prince escapes. He flees thousands of miles away, all the way to Spain, and founds a new Umayyad emirate in Cordoba, a seed that will, over a century later, grow into its own rival caliphate, but we'll come back to that. Now the center of power shifts entirely. The Abbasids move the capital away from Damascus to a newly built city on the banks of the Tigris River, Baghdad. And what happens in Baghdad over the next 2 centuries is nothing short of one of the greatest intellectual explosions in human history. This is the Islamic Golden Age. Under caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, Baghdad becomes the intellectual capital of the entire world. They build the House of Wisdom, a massive center of learning where scholars, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish alike, translate and expand upon Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. This is where algebra gets its name, from the work of the mathematician al-Khwarizmi. This is where the foundations of modern optics, chemistry, and medicine are laid. While much of Europe is enduring what history books call the Dark Ages, Baghdad has public hospitals, paper mills, libraries holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, and a level of urban sophistication that European travelers describe with disbelief centuries later. But political power and intellectual glory do not always move together. Even as Baghdad's libraries grow, the Abbasid Caliph's real political control starts shrinking. Provincial governors far from the capital begin acting more and more independently. In Egypt, a rival dynasty called the Fatimids, followers of Shia Islam who claim descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima, actually declares its own competing caliphate in 909, setting up its capital in a newly founded city, Cairo. For a period of history, there are literally 3 men on earth simultaneously claiming the title of caliph, one in Baghdad, one in Cordoba, and one in Cairo, each insisting they alone hold the legitimate successorship to the Prophet. The unity of the Ummah, at least politically, is now permanently fractured. And then, in the 13th century, a threat arrives that none of these dynasties are prepared for. the Mongols. In 1258, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a commander named Hulagu Khan, marches on Baghdad with an army that shows no mercy. The city that had stood for 500 years as the beating intellectual heart of the Islamic world is besieged, sacked, and burned. Historians describe the Tigris River running black with the ink of destroyed manuscripts and red with blood for days. The last Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, al-Mustasim, is executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, so that no royal blood would touch the ground. The House of Wisdom, centuries of accumulated human knowledge, is gone in a matter of weeks. It is one of the single greatest cultural catastrophes in recorded history. You would think that would be the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. And politically, in Baghdad, it is. But something remarkable happens next. A surviving member of the Abbasid family flees to Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultanate, a powerful military class now ruling Egypt, installs him as a symbolic, ceremonial caliph. For nearly 250 more years, a shadow Abbasid Caliphate continues to exist in Cairo, with real religious prestige, but almost no political power. It is a caliphate in name, kept alive mostly for legitimacy, while actual military and political power rests entirely with the sultans who host them. Meanwhile, over in Cordoba, that surviving Umayyad prince's descendants had built something extraordinary of their own. In 929, the ruler Abd al-Rahman III formally declares himself caliph, creating the Caliphate of Cordoba, and under his rule and his successors, Islamic Spain, known as Al-Andalus, becomes another dazzling center of science, philosophy, architecture, and coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, still standing today, is a physical monument to this era. But by the early 1000s, internal political collapse tears the Caliphate of Cordoba apart into dozens of small rival kingdoms, and within a century, Christian kingdoms in the north begin the long, grinding process of reconquest that will eventually end Muslim rule in Spain entirely by 1492. So by the late 1400s, the map looks like this. The Abbasid line survives only as a ceremonial title under Mamluk protection in Cairo. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt had already collapsed centuries earlier, overthrown by the famous general Saladin in 1171, who abolished it and restored Sunni allegiance to the Abbasids. And the glory of Cordoba is a fading memory under Christian reconquest. Into this vacuum steps the empire that will hold the title of caliphate longer, and more visibly on the world stage, than almost any other, the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire had been rising for 2 centuries already, built from a small frontier principality in Anatolia into a formidable military power that, in 1453, achieved something Muslim armies had attempted and failed at for over 700 years: the conquest of Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, under the young Sultan Mehmed II. It is one of the most consequential military victories in world history, ending the Byzantine Empire once and for all, and giving the Ottomans a capital that would be renamed Istanbul. But the Ottomans do not hold the title of caliph yet. That changes in 1517, when the Ottoman Sultan Selim Thau conquers Egypt, defeats the Mamluk Sultanate, and, according to widely repeated tradition, receives the transfer of the caliphate title from the last ceremonial Abbasid caliph in Cairo. From this point forward, the Ottoman sultans begin using the title of caliph alongside sultan, positioning themselves as the supreme political and religious authority for Sunni Muslims worldwide. Under this dual sultan-caliph system, the Ottoman Empire reaches heights of power that stretch across 3 continents, controlling territory from the gates of Vienna in Europe, across North Africa, through the Arabian Peninsula, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and deep into the Middle East. For centuries, the Ottoman Caliphate is the dominant political force in the Islamic world, and the title carries real symbolic weight. Ottoman sultans are seen by many Muslims globally as the protector of the faith and the holy sites. But by the 19th century, the empire that once terrified European kings starts earning a very different nickname: the sick man of Europe. Military defeats, territorial losses, economic strain, and internal political upheaval steadily erode Ottoman power. World War I becomes the final blow. The Ottomans side with Germany, and the Central Powers lose catastrophically, and by 1918 the empire that had lasted over 600 years is being carved up by the victorious Allied powers. And then comes the ending that, to many across the Muslim world, felt like the closing of an era that had lasted nearly 1,300 years. In 1923, following the Turkish War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk establishes the modern secular Republic of Turkey. At first, the Ottoman Sultanate is abolished, but the Caliphate is symbolically kept alive, separated from the throne. It doesn't last. On March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey formally abolishes the Caliphate altogether. The last caliph, Abdülmecid II, is exiled from the country. For the first time since the year 632, since that argument in a courtyard in Medina, there is no one on earth holding the formal title of Khalifa of Islam. That silence has lasted over a century now. There have been attempts to revive the title since: political movements, self-declared claimants, most notoriously a terrorist organization that infamously and illegitimately declared a so-called caliphate in 2014 before being crushed and rejected by the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world and Islamic scholarship as a fraudulent, violent perversion of the concept entirely. But no restoration has ever achieved anything close to the religious legitimacy or global recognition that the historical caliphates held. So here is where this story leaves us. 4 rightly guided caliphs who built the foundation. An Umayyad dynasty that expanded faster than almost any empire in history. An Abbasid golden age that lit up the world with knowledge while Europe slept through its darkest centuries. A rival caliphate in Cordoba that made Islamic Spain a marvel of civilization. A Fatimid Caliphate that built Cairo into a rival capital of learning. And an Ottoman Caliphate that carried the title into the modern era, only to see it dissolved in the wreckage of the First World War. 14 centuries, dozens of rulers, golden ages and burned libraries, unity and civil war, sometimes only years apart. This is not a simple story, and it was never meant to be. Because empires built by human beings always carry human ambition, human rivalry, and human faith, all tangled together. If this kind of real history hits different when it's laid out like this, don't scroll past it. Subscribe and stay for the next one.